In the quiet of the 1950s, the world was a canvas of gray stone and predictable lines. Yet in the harbor city of Sydney, a dream began to take shape that would eventually ripple across the oceans to the shores of America and beyond. It all started with an international design competition launched in 1957 that invited the most brilliant minds of the era to imagine something truly transcendent for Bennelong Point. Among the hundreds of entries was a set of sketches from a relatively unknown Danish architect named Jorn Utzon, who lived in a small cottage near the sea where the rhythm of the waves influences every thought. Utzon did not submit blueprints filled with rigid angles or traditional columns, but instead presented freehand drawings of white sails that seemed to capture the wind itself. According to legend, his entry was initially discarded by the judging committee, only to be rescued from a reject pile by the renowned architect Eero Saarinen, who recognized in those sweeping curves a spark of pure genius that broke every rule of modern architecture. As you listen to this story, imagine the soft scratching of a pencil against parchment in a quiet studio in Denmark, where the air is cool and the only sound is the distant tolling of a bell. The journey of the Sydney Opera House is like a long, slow walk through a forest of ideas where time loses its meaning and the complexity of the world melts into a single elegant curve. Utzon looked at the shells of the sea and the segments of an orange to find a mathematical harmony that could support the weight of thousands of tons of concrete. The construction was a marathon of patience lasting many years and involving the hands of thousands of workers who move with the steady deliberation of a ticking clock. Across the Pacific, the American public watched with fascination as the sculpture in stone began to rise from the harbor, like a limestone cliff emerging from a morning mist. Every tile placed upon the roof was a moment of stillness, every beam of steel a testament to human endurance. And as the decades passed, the controversy of its cost and the politics of its creation faded into the background, leaving only the silent majesty of its form against the deep blue of the water. It is a story of vision that refused to be dimmed by the practicalities of the earth, a reminder that the most beautiful things often take the longest to bloom. So let your mind drift with the tide as it washes against the base of the podium, feeling the cool salt air and the warmth of the sun reflecting off a million ceramic tiles that glisten like fresh snow. There is no rush to reach the end of this tale, because the building itself stands as a permanent pause in the frantic pace of history, inviting you to breathe deeply and settle into the soft cushions of your own thoughts. The geometry of the spheres dictates the flow of the roofline and the flow of your breath as you sink deeper into a state of total relaxation. The world outside is quiet now. The cranes have long since stopped moving. The architects have laid down their pens, and the only thing that remains is the peaceful silhouette of the sails against a starlit sky. Let the steady repetition of the construction details act as a lullaby, where the pouring of concrete is as gentle as falling rain, and the polishing of the glass walls is as rhythmic as the beating of a heart. In this space, there are no deadlines or pressures, only the slow and steady realization of a masterpiece that took its time to become what was always meant to be, a sanctuary for the arts and a monument to the quiet power of a single bold idea that whispered across the Atlantic and found a home in the hearts of dreamers everywhere. The story continues through the decades with a calm persistence, through the changing of the seasons and the soft light of the Australian spring, until finally the gates opened and the music began to play a melody so soft and so deep that it could put the entire world to rest. In the early morning light of 1959, the air at Bennelong Point was thick with the scent of salt spray and the low, steady hum of heavy machinery as the first phase of an impossible journey began to unfold on the rugged edge of Sydney Harbor. The project was launched with a sense of urgency that felt distinctly like the fast-paced industrial spirit of America, where time was a currency and progress was a relentless tide that waited for no one. Even though the final blueprints for the massive sails had not yet been drawn and the mathematics of the roof remained a mystery, trapped in the mind of Jorn Utzon, the government decided to break ground in a bold, fast-track approach that mirrored the ambitious skyscraper construction seen in cities like Chicago and New York. Imagine the rhythmic thud of the pile drivers sinking deep into the sandstone bedrock as workers move with the slow, deliberate grace of a pendulum swinging back and forth through the humid air. The construction of the massive podium was a task of immense proportions, requiring thousands of tons of concrete to be poured in a continuous flow that felt as steady and calming as a river winding its way through a vast, quiet valley. As you listen to this story, let your mind wander to the edge of the water, where the waves lap gently against the foundation, and the sound of the wind through the scaffolding creates a soft metallic hollow music that lulls the senses into a state of total peace. There was a peculiar tension between the rush to build and the stillness of the design process as engineers sat at wooden desks piled high with sketches trying to solve problems that had never been encountered in the history of architecture. The American style of starting before finishing meant that the foundations were being laid, while the very weight they were to carry was still an unknown variable floating in a sea of theoretical calculations. This created a sense of building a mountain while still, deciding its height, and the process became a long meditation on faith and engineering prowess. Day after day the sun would rise over the harbor, painting the concrete in shades of gold and amber, while the workers moved in a synchronized dance of labor that seemed to stretch into eternity. There is something deeply soothing about the repetition of a construction site from a distance, where the individual movements blur into a single cohesive motion of growth and transformation. The podium rose slowly from the earth like a natural extension of the coast, becoming a massive stage for a drama that would take 14 years to complete. Every truck that arrived and every bucket of cement that was emptied added to the weight of the story, providing a heavy, grounding presence that makes the world feel solid and secure. The complexity of the task was hidden beneath the surface, like the deep roots of an ancient tree, while the world watched in quiet anticipation for the sails to appear. In the offices, the air was filled with the soft rustle of tracing paper and the quiet murmur of voices discussing structural loads and wind resistance in tones so low they could be mistaken for a distant forest breeze. The fast-track method meant that every decision was a leap into the dark, but the steady pace of the work provided a comforting rhythm that suggested everything would eventually find its place in the grand design. As the years of the early 60s began to blend together the construction, site became a landscape of its own, a world of gray stone and iron that stood in silent contrast to the sparkling blue of the harbor. The American audience of the time recognized the spirit of daring and the willingness to face challenges head-on even when the path forward was obscured by the fog of technical uncertainty. As you sink deeper into the comfort of your surroundings, imagine the vastness of the podium under a moonlit sky, empty and quiet after the workers had gone home, leaving only the sound of the tide and the distant calls of night birds. The foundation was now a permanent part of the earth, and the stage was set for the next chapter, where the curves of the roof would finally begin to reach for the stars. There is no need to worry about the complications or the delays that would follow, because in this moment the project is simply a promise of beauty and a testament to the patient work of human hands. The story rolls on like a slow, deep ocean swell, carrying you further away from the noise of the modern world, and into a place of architectural dreams where every stone is a resting place and every beam is a pillar of strength. The light of the harbor fades into a soft velvet blue, and the memory of the fast-track rush turns into a gentle hum that vibrates through the ground and up into the subconscious, bringing a sense of order and calm to the end of the day. The construction continues in your mind with a steady, noiseless efficiency where every piece fits perfectly and every challenge is met with a quiet grace until the entire structure is bathed in the soft glow of a timeless twilight. As the foundations of the podium stood firm against the rhythmic tides of the harbor, the project entered a long and quiet period of intellectual struggle that would last for several years as the world's most brilliant engineers and mathematicians faced a crisis of geometry that seemed almost insurmountable. The massive shells that Jorn Utzon had envisioned were beautiful and ethereal, like the wings of a bird caught in mid-flight, but they defied the traditional laws of structural engineering, and the technology of the early 1960s was being pushed to its absolute breaking point. Imagine a vast room filled with wooden tables and the soft scratching of slide rules as men in white shirts leaned over infinite scrolls of paper, trying to calculate the stresses of curves that had no simple mathematical definition. For over 3 years, the firm of Ove Arup and Partners used some of the earliest computers in existence, machines that were the size of entire rooms and hummed with a low, constant drone that sounded like a distant beehive in a summer meadow. These early computers worked slowly, processing data for hours and days to solve equations that would today take only a fraction of a second, and the slow repetition of these mechanical thoughts created a backdrop of steady, persistent effort that mirrored the patience of the stone itself. The crisis was not one of materials, but a form as the parabolic shapes Utzon originally drew were found to be impossible to build using the construction methods of the time, leading to hundreds of different versions of the shells being designed and then discarded in a quiet cycle of trial and error. As you listen to this narrative, let your mind settle into the image of a quiet library where the air is still and the only movement is the slow turning of a page or the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. The engineers were wandering through a mathematical fog, searching for a way to make the heavy concrete feel as light as air, and the weight of their responsibility was a heavy blanket that kept the project grounded in reality. They looked at every possible shape from ellipses to complex parabolas, but nothing seemed to harmonize the aesthetics of the architect with the rigid requirements of gravity and wind. The American audience of the era followed these updates in technical journals and newspapers, seeing it as a grand puzzle that challenged the very limits of human ingenuity, and the slow pace of the progress became a form of national meditation for Australia and a source of wonder for the world. There's a deep and profound comfort in the idea of thousands of hours being dedicated to the perfection of a single curve where time is not an enemy, but a tool used to carve out the truth from a block of uncertainty. The struggle was silent and invisible to the people walking past the harbor, who only saw the empty podium waiting for its crown, but underneath the surface, a great intellectual fire was burning at a low end. Steady heat. The complexity of the shells required a new way of thinking about how buildings stand up, and the frustration of the engineers was tempered by a quiet dedication to the vision of a masterpiece that they knew would one day define a continent. Picture the glow of the vacuum tubes and the early computers casting a soft orange light in the dark rooms of the London offices where the calculations were performed, and feel the steady pulse of the data moving through the wires like a slow heartbeat. Every failed attempt brought them one step closer to the solution, and the repetition of the process became a soothing rhythm that calmed the nerves and focused the mind on the long journey ahead. The shells remained a dream for a long time, floating just out of reach like a cloud on the horizon, while the mathematics slowly caught up to the imagination of the artist. There is no rush to solve the problem in this story because the beauty of the struggle is in the persistence and the quiet confidence that a solution exists somewhere in the infinite patterns of geometry. As the years turned from 1960 to 1961, and into 1962 the search for the answer became a way of life for the design team, a long and peaceful walk through a labyrinth of numbers, where every turn was a lesson in patience, and every dead end was a reason to breathe deeply and start again. The world outside was changing fast, but inside the world of the opera house construction, time had slowed down to a crawl, as if the building itself was waiting for the perfect moment to be born. Let the thought of these millions of calculations wash over you like a gentle rain that softens the earth and prepares the ground for something magnificent to grow. The air in the story is cool and the light is soft, and the sound of slide rules moving back and forth is a lullaby that speaks of order and precision, and the quiet power of the human mind to overcome any obstacle through steady and unwavering focus. Eventually, the crisis would lead to a breakthrough. That would change architecture forever, but for now we stay in a quiet period of the search, where the questions are many and the answers are still sleeping beneath the surface of the paper. The story of the engineering crisis is a story of deep rest and intellectual hibernation, where the world holds its breath and waits for the light of a new idea to break through the clouds and illuminate the path forward toward the completion of the sails. In the soft quiet of a Danish morning, inside a studio filled with the gentle scent of old paper, and drafting lead Jorn Utzon sat surrounded by the complex riddles of geometry that haunted the Sydney Harbour project for years, as the engineers in London struggled with thousands of different parabolic shapes that never quite fit together. The architect found himself peeling an orange in a moment of pure and simple clarity that would eventually be known as his eureka moment. Imagine the soft sound of the fruit being divided and the realization dawning that every single shell of the massive roof could be cut from the surface of one single perfect theoretical sphere, which meant that the complex curves were not random, but were all part of a unified and harmonious whole. This discovery was like a deep breath after a long period of suffocating complexity, because it meant that the geometry could finally be broken down into repeatable triangular segments that were identical in their curvature, allowing the massive sails to be manufactured in a factory setting rather than being cast in place, which brought a sense of industrial order to a chaotic dream. The American audience of the time, who valued both the beauty of art and the efficiency of the assembly line, would have appreciated how this one simple thought turned a mathematical nightmare into a tangible reality that could be built piece by piece like a giant stone puzzle. As you listen to the rhythmic repetition of this story, visualize the surface of that great invisible sphere. Floating over the harbor, a giant silent glass ball from which the white shells are being gently sliced and lowered into place by cranes that move with the slow grace of a sleeping giant. The mathematics shifted from the impossible to the elegant, and the tension that had gripped the project for years began to melt away like morning mist under a warm sun, leaving only the steady and predictable work of precasting the concrete ribs. Each rib was a segment of that same sphere, meaning the molds could be reused over and over again, creating a soothing pattern production that echoed the heartbeat of the harbor itself. There's a profound peace in the idea of a single unifying principle solving 1,000 different problems, and as Utzon worked out the details, the air in his studio seemed to grow lighter, and the shadows grew longer and softer as the sun dipped below the horizon. The spherical solution was a gift of simplicity to a world that had become too complicated, and it allowed the engineers to finally put down their slide rules and breathe a sigh of relief as the computers began to hum with a new and much simpler set of instructions. The construction site at Benelong Point transformed into a place of assembly where the pieces arrived with a perfect fit, and the workers could move with a quiet confidence that every bolt and every joint would align with the celestial geometry of the sphere. Think of the millions of tiles that would later be applied to these surfaces, all following the same curve and the way the light would hit them at the same angle, because they all belonged to the same mathematical family. This moment of clarity did not just save the building, it saved the vision, and ensured that the sails would finally rise above the water in a way that felt natural and inevitable, like the shells of the sea or the arc of a rising moon. The story of the sphere is a story of finding the one true path through a forest of confusion, and it invites you to let go of your own worries and settle into the comfort of a world where everything eventually fits together if you look at it from the right perspective. The weight of the concrete ribs becomes weightless in your mind as they soar upward following the invisible line of the sphere, and the sound of the wind through the harbor becomes a soft whisper of approval for a design that finally found its soul. The days turned into weeks of quiet planning as the transition from theory to practice was made with the slow and steady deliberation of a craftsman carving wood, and the project moved forward with a sense of destiny that was as unshakable as the stone foundation beneath it. The American spirit of innovation was mirrored in this Danish architect's breakthrough, proving that sometimes the biggest problems require the smallest and most organic solutions found in the simple geometry of nature. As the sun sets over the imagined harbor of this tale, the silhouette of the shells begins to take shape in your mind, not as a collection of separate parts, but as a single unified song sung in the key of the sphere. And the quiet repetition of this thought acts as an anchor for your consciousness, drawing you deeper into a state of rest where the lines are smooth and the angles are soft, and the world is governed by a beautiful and predictable harmony that never fails and never falters until the very last light of the day is faded into a deep and dreamless blue. As the great concrete ribs of the shell stood tall and bare against the Australian sky, the time had come to clothe the structure in a skin of shimmering light. And this task fell to more than 1 million individual ceramic tiles, crafted with ancient precision in the distant workshops of Sweden, where the clay was cool and the fires of the kilns burned with a steady, reliable warmth. Imagine the journey of these tiles across the vast blue oceans, traveling from the northern forests to the southern sun to create a finish that would capture the very essence of the harbor and the sky. Jorn Utzon did not want a plain white surface that would blind the eye, but rather a subtle texture that would change its character with the moving sun, and so he worked closely with a company called Hoganas to develop a special kind of stoneware tile known as the chevron tile, which features a unique glaze that reflects light in a soft and diffused manner. These tiles were not just flat pieces of ceramic, but were carefully designed in two distinct finishes, one a glossy white and the other a matte cream, so that when they were placed together in a specific chevron pattern, they would create a play of light and shadow that looks like the scales of a fish or the ruffled surface of a quiet lake. For 3 years, the Swedish craftsmen worked in a slow and rhythmic cycle of molding and firing and glazing, ensuring that every single one of the 1,056,006 tiles was perfect and free of flaws before being packed into crates and sent on their long voyage. As you listen to this story, picture the workers at Benelong Point laying these tiles into large precast panels on the ground, rather than climbing the steep curves of the roof, which allowed them to work with the focus and patience of a weaver at a loom. Each panel was a masterpiece of geometry, where the tiles were arranged with such precision that the grout lines became invisible from a distance, leaving only a seamless expanse of glistening white that seems to glow from within. When the sun rises over the Pacific, the tiles catch the first golden rays and turn the opera house into a beacon of warmth. And as the day progresses into bright afternoon, the matte and glossy surfaces work together to soften the glare, making the building look like a cloud that has settled gently on the water. For an American audience who appreciates the fine details of craftsmanship and the luxury of quality materials, the story of the Swedish tiles is a reminder that the grandest monuments are built from the smallest and most humble elements, handled with care and devotion. There is a deep sense of peace in the thought of a million tiles resting side by side, held together by a strength that is both physical and aesthetic, and the way they reflect the ripples of the harbor water creates a living, breathing connection between the architecture and the natural world. The white of the roof is never just one color, but 1,000. Shades of pearl and silver and cream that shift and flow like the thoughts in a drifting mind as it prepares for sleep. Every tile was placed with a quiet intention, and the sound of the trowels and the soft click of ceramic against ceramic formed a symphony of construction that was as steady as a heartbeat and as calming as the distant sound of surf on a sandy beach. As the years passed and the tiles became a permanent part of the Sydney skyline, they began to collect the memories of the harbor, the salt and the wind and the shadows of the passing ships, all while maintaining their pristine and timeless beauty. You can almost feel the cool, smooth surface of the glaze beneath your fingertips, a texture that is both hard as stone and soft as silk, inviting you to let go of the day and sink into a world of pure form and light. The pattern of the chevron is a visual lullaby, a repeating V shape that draws the eye upward and then back down in a gentle wave that mimics the rise and fall of your own breathing as you settle deeper into the warmth of your covers. The tiles do not scream for attention, but rather wait patiently to be noticed, providing a subtle richness that makes the building feel alive even in the deepest part of the night, when the moon is the only lamp in the sky. Let the image of a million white tiles dancing in the moonlight fill your vision, creating a blanket of light that covers the harbor and wraps the world in a silent and protective glow, where everything is orderly and everything is beautiful and everything is exactly where it is supposed to be. The journey of the Swedish clay from the earth to the sky is a complete circle of creation that brings a sense of closure and satisfaction to the story of the sails. And as the last tile is mentally placed in your mind, the building stands finished and glowing and ready to watch over the harbor for 1,000 years to come. As the mid-60s arrived, the atmosphere around the rising white shells of the harbor began to change, as the quiet mathematical piece of the design phase was met by the loud and heavy pressure of public life and political shifts that would eventually lead to a heartbreaking turning point in the history of architecture. The cost of the project had grown like the tide, rising far beyond the initial estimates of $7 million, as the complexity of the spherical solution and the high quality of the Swedish tiles required a level of funding that the government had not anticipated. For an American audience who understands a delicate balance between a grand vision and a public budget, this period was a slow-motion collision between the idealism of art and the cold reality of finance. In 1965, a new government took office in the state of New South Wales, and the once warm relationship between the visionary Bjorn Utzon and his patrons began to cool like the stone at twilight, as the new Minister of Works, Davis Hughes, demanded stricter controls and more frequent reports on every penny spent. Imagine the long hallways of the Parliament buildings, where the air was heavy with the scent of old wood and the sound of footsteps echoing on marble floors, as the tension built up day by day in a series of meetings that felt like a slow darkening of the sky before a storm. Utzon was a man of the sea and the light, who believed that perfection could not be rushed or measured by a simple clock, but the political world moved to a different beat, one of deadlines and spreadsheets and rising frustration. The conflict centered on the payment of fees and the control over the interior designs, which Utzon held close to his heart like a precious secret, while the government saw them as expenses that needed to be trimmed and managed. As you listen to this story, feel the weight of the silence that began to grow between the architect and the city he was trying to gift. With a masterpiece of silence that was more painful than the loudest construction noise. In February of 1966, the pressure reached a breaking point, and Utzon, in a moment of profound sadness and exhaustion, submitted his resignation and prepared to leave the shores of Australia forever. The departure was quiet and somber, as the man who had imagined the sails packed his sketches and his dreams into wooden crates and boarded a plane, taking with him the soul of the project and leaving behind a skeleton of concrete that did not yet know how to be a building without its creator. He flew across the vast oceans back to the familiar mists of Denmark, never to set foot on Australian soil again, and never to see the completed shells reflecting the light of the harbor in person. There's a deep and melancholy rest in the thought of a journey interrupted a story that pauses mid-sentence and leaves the rest of the imagination as the project passed into the hands of a team of Australian architects who had to find their own way through the labyrinth Utzon had built. The news of his leaving rippled across the globe, reaching the United States, where architects and dreamers alike felt a sense of loss for the purity of the original vision, now clouded by the dust of political debate. The construction site became a place of mourning for a time, where the wind whistled through the empty ribs of the shells, and the cranes stood still like giant rusted birds, waiting for a command that would never come from the same voice again. Yet the work had to continue, because the stone and the tiles were already there, and the promise to public was a heavy anchor that could not be lifted. The years that followed were a long period of transition where the interiors were reimagined and the grand vision was adapted to practicalities of the era, but the ghost of Utzon's intent remained in every curve of the concrete and every shimmer of the glass. Think of the architect in his quiet home in Denmark, looking out at a different sea and knowing that his heart was still beating in the rhythm of the Sydney harbor waves, while his hands were no longer on the wheel. The story of his departure is not one of anger, but a soft fading light of sunset that marks the end of one chapter and beginning a long and steady twilight, where the building had to learn how to stand on its own. As you drift further into relaxation, let the image of the departing architect remind you that some visions are so large they belong to the world rather than any one person, and that even in his absence, the building continued to grow a life of its own, fueled by the energy of the thousands who stayed behind to finish the task. The political storms eventually passed, leaving behind a quiet determination to see the project through to the end, and the rising cost became a distant memory as the silhouette of the sails became the symbol of the nation's identity. The tragedy of the exit is softened by the passage of time, becoming a gentle part of the building's legend, a layer of human emotion that makes the cold concrete feel warm and relatable to everyone who looks upon it. Let the steady pulse of the story carry you into a deep sleep where the architect's sketches turn into birds that fly across the moon, and the white sails of the opera house are a safe harbor for your thoughts to rest, until morning light returns to turn the tiles back into gold. After the departure of the Danish architect, the second phase of the construction began in a quiet atmosphere transition as a new team of Australian architects led by Peter Hall and Lionel Todd took up the heavy mantle of completing the interiors and the glass walls of the massive structure. The task was no longer about dreaming of impossible curves, but about the steady and methodical work of creating functional spaces that could hold the sound of 1,000 voices and the resonance of a symphony orchestra. Imagine the interior of the shells as a vast hollow cavern of raw gray concrete, waiting for a new soul to be breathed into its empty chambers where the air was cool and the echoes of the harbor outside bounced softly off the high arched ceilings. The shift in vision was a journey from the experimental to practical as the new team sought to balance the grand sculptural exterior with the reality of mid-century performance needs. For an American audience familiar with the great concert halls of the 20th century, this phase was a study in acoustics and the warm textures of wood and metal that define a world-class stage. The original plans for the multipurpose halls were reimagined into specialized spaces, leading to the creation of the Grand Concert Hall and the Opera Theater, each with its own unique atmosphere of focused attention and artistic purpose. Hundreds of thousands of feet of Australian hardwoods were brought into the site, their natural grain and earthy scent providing a soft contrast to the cold white ceramic of the roof. Picture the long planks of brush box and birch being fitted into place by carpenters whose hands move with the rhythmic precision of a ticking clock, creating the intricate wooden ribbing that lines the walls of the concert hall today. This was chosen not just for its beauty, but for its ability to absorb and reflect sound in a way that creates a warm and immersive acoustic environment, making the listener feel as though they are inside a massive hollow instrument. The installation of the grand organ was another slow and meditative process, involving over 10,000 pipes, each one tuned with the patience of a diamond cutter to ensure that the music would flow through the space like a gentle river. As you listen to this story, feel the weight of the red carpet beneath your feet and the smoothness of the timber handrails as the building begins to feel like a home for the arts rather than a construction site. The glass walls, which Utzon had imagined as simple plywood structures, were redesigned as massive curtains of steel and glass that lean out over the harbor at a sharp angle, capturing the reflection of the ripples and the movement of the fairies in a never-ending cinematic display. The assembly of these glass panes was a delicate dance between heavy machinery and fragile transparency, where every piece had to be aligned with the precision of a telescope lens to ensure the safety and the aesthetic of the facade. There is a deep and profound rest in the thought of this transition, where the wild energy of the first decade was channeled into the quiet craftsmanship of the second decade, turning a mountain of stone into a sanctuary of sound. The architects worked in shadow of a legacy that was both a burden and an inspiration, finding ways to respect the geometry of the shells while solving the puzzles of seating and lighting and backstage flow. The color palette shifted to deep reds and warm golds and the natural hues of the Australian bush, creating a sense of groundedness that balances the soaring ambition of the exterior. The world outside was moving through the turbulent years of the late 60s and early 70s, but inside the Opera House, the work remained a constant and steady pulse of progress that offered a sense of order and continuity. Every light fixture and every seat cushion was a small decision that contributed to the grand silence of completed space, where even a whisper can be heard from the furthest corner of the hall. The American spirit of pragmatism was alive in this phase as the team navigated the technical challenges of climate, control, and fire safety within a structure that had no precedents and no rules to follow. As you drift further into comfort of your surroundings, imagine the first rehearsals in the empty halls where the sound of a single violin would rise up into the dark wooden vaults and linger there like a soft cloud before slowly fading into the stillness. The second phase was a long and peaceful walk through the details of interiority, where the focus was on the human experience of the building and the way a person feels when they are cradled by the architecture. It was a time of healing and completion, where the wounds of the political conflict were covered by the beauty of the woodwork and the clarity of the glass, until the building was finally ready to speak to the world in its own voice. The story of the interior is a story of harmony and the slow layering of material upon material until the shell becomes a pearl and the dream becomes a place where we can sit and listen to the music of our own thoughts. Let the repetition of the carpenter's hammer and the architect's pen act as a lullaby that guides you into a state of total relaxation, where the walls are strong and the wood is warm and the light of the harbor is filtered through the glass into a soft and soothing glow that marks the end of the day and the beginning of a long and restorative sleep. In the quiet world of finance and logistics, where the heartbeat of a project is measured in the steady flow of currency and the rustle of ledger, Page's The Story of the Sydney Opera House takes a long and hypnotic turn into the realm of astronomical numbers that grew with the slow persistence of a rising tide. When the first dreams were whispered in 1957, the estimated cost was a humble $7 million, a figure that seemed manageable and modest for a monument of such ambition. Yet as the years drifted by like clouds over the harbor, reality of the engineering and precision of the Swedish tiles caused the budget to swell and expand until it eventually surpassed $102 million, which was an increase of over 1,400%. For an American audience who understands the grand scale of public works and the heavy weight of fiscal responsibility, this numerical journey is like watching a mountain grow grain by grain beneath a silver moon. The gap between the initial estimate and the final cost became a source of national conversation. But the solution was as unique as the building itself, because the government of New South Wales created a state lottery dedicated entirely to the construction of the Opera House. Imagine the millions of colorful lottery tickets being printed and distributed across the land, each one a tiny paper promise, and a small contribution to the rising white sails. Every week for years, the citizens of Australia participated in this rhythmic game of chance, where the prize money was a dream for some, but the real winner was the concrete and steel rising at Bennelong Point. This steady stream of lottery revenue acted like a slow drip of water, filling a vast reservoir, ensuring that the work never stopped even when the cost became a source of political heat and public debate. The lottery was a collective meditation on the value of art, where the small change of nation built a world heritage, sight that would eventually pay for itself many times over in tourism and pride. As you listen to the steady repetition of these facts, let your mind settle into the image of a great counting house, where the only sound is the soft clicking of an abacus and the scratching of fountain pens on heavy parchment. The transition from 7 million to 100 million was not a sudden burst, but a slow and inevitable climb, as the technology required to build the impossible had to be invented from scratch at great expense. The cost of the early computers and the specialized factory in Sweden, and the thousands of tons of steel reinforcement added layers of depth to the financial story, making it a heavy and solid foundation for the lighter dreams of the architects. There is a deep and rhythmic comfort in the idea of a whole nation slowly and patiently paying for its future icon one ticket at a time through a system that turned a gamble into a guarantee of beauty. The numbers are large and cold, but the way they were gathered was warm and human, involving the hopes of everyday people who wanted to see their harbor transformed by a mid-century modern marvel. As the decades passed, the controversy of the cost began to fade into the background like the noise of a distant city at night, leaving only the quiet satisfaction of a debt fully paid and a masterpiece fully realized. The financial weight of the project became a grounding force that ensured every detail was finished to the highest standard because the lottery provided a sense of independence from the usual constraints of a government budget. Think of the millions of hands that held those lottery tickets, and the way their small actions combined to create a force as powerful as the wind in the sails of the roof. The story of the money is a story of endurance and the belief that some things are worth far more than the gold required to build them. And as the final accounts were settled, the value of the building was no longer measured in dollars, but in the way it captured the light of the sun and the imagination of the world. Let the thought of these millions of transactions wash over you like a slow and steady rain that nourishes the earth and brings a sense of completion to the day. The ledger is now closed and the balance is perfect, and the building stands as a testament to what can be achieved when a society decides to invest in a dream that will last for centuries. The economy of the story is one of rest and stability, where every expense has been accounted for and every challenge has been met with quiet and persistent resolve that leads to a peaceful and dreamless sleep. On the 20th day of October in 1973, the long journey that had begun with a simple sketch in a Danish studio finally reached its grand crescendo as the city of Sydney woke up to a morning of brilliant blue skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of the sea across the harbor, where the white sails of the Opera House stood finished and gleaming like polished pearls against the deep water. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of historic arrival as Queen Elizabeth II prepared to officially open the doors of a building that had been a construction site for 14 long years and a source of constant debate, but which in this single moment was about to be transformed into an eternal global icon. For an American audience who looks back on the grand ceremonies of the 20th century, this day represents the birth of a landmark that would rival the Statue of Liberty or the Golden Gate Bridge in the hearts of dreamers everywhere. Imagine the harbor filled with thousands of small boats and majestic ships, their colorful flags flutter in the wind, while millions of people gathered on the shore in a quiet and expectant hush that felt like the world was holding its breath. The Queen, dressed in a soft yellow outfit that caught the sunlight, stepped onto the granite podium, and with a voice that was calm and steady spoke to the crowd about the power of the human spirit to create beauty out of thin air and hard stone. As she spoke, the controversy of the rising costs and the departure of the architect and the technical struggles of the 60s seemed to dissolve into the bright light of the afternoon, becoming nothing more than the necessary shadows that give a masterpiece its depth. The moment the ribbon was cut and the music began to play at the Sydney Opera House was no longer a project or a problem, but a living symbol of a nation's identity and a testament to the idea that architecture can be as moving as a symphony. The transition was instant and profound as the image of the white sails was beamed across the world through television satellites and printed in newspapers from New York to London and San Francisco, capturing the imagination of a global public who saw in its curves the future of modern design. The air was filled with the sound of trumpets and the distant boom of cannons, but inside the quiet recesses of your mind the story feels as peaceful as the slow drift of a cloud across the sun, because the long struggle was finally over and the building had found its place in the world. The millions of tiles on the roof shimmered with a special intensity, that day reflecting the joy of a city that had finally seen its dream come to life, and the harbor water lapped gently against the base of the podium as if to welcome its new companion into the permanent landscape of the earth. As you listen to this narrative, let the image of the festive crowds fade into a soft focus, leaving only the silhouette of the building against the setting sun as the fireworks began to burst in slow motion over the water, painting the white shells in shades of rose and violet and gold. The transition from a site of labor to a site of art was complete, and the Opera House began its long life as a sanctuary where the world's greatest performers would come to share their gifts in a space that was itself a performance. There is a deep and lasting comfort in the thought of a journey reaching its destination, and the stability of the stone and the glass provides a grounding presence that invites you to let go of the day's worries and settle into a deep and restful state of being. The building stands as a bridge between the land and the sea, and between the past and the future. And as the celebrations of 1973 slowly faded into quiet nights of the years that followed, the Opera House only grew in stature and grace. The American spirit of achievement is mirrored in this moment of triumph where a bold vision was seen. Through to the end despite every obstacle and every doubt, until it became a part of the world's shared heritage. As the moon rises over the harbor in your imagination, the lights of the Opera House glow with a soft and steady radiance that promises safety and beauty and the quiet. Repetition of the waves against the shore acts as a final lullaby to close this chapter history. The story has moved from the first pencil line to the final royal ceremony, and everything is now in its proper place, and the world is quiet, and the sails are still, and the journey is complete, which means you can finally close your eyes and drift away into a peaceful and dreamless sleep, knowing that the masterpiece is finished and the dream is real. In the quiet passage of time, the Sydney Opera House has moved beyond its origins to become a timeless monument of human achievement, and in 2007, it was officially inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, marking it as a treasure that belongs to all of humanity, and not just a single nation or a single era. Imagine the silent hallways of the United Nations where the air is still and the records of the world's most beautiful places are kept in heavy books, and there among the ancient pyramids and the grand cathedrals sits this modern marvel of white sails and curved concrete as a symbol of what the 20th century was truly capable of achieving. For an American audience looking across the Pacific, the story of this building is a reflection of the universal human spirit that dares to ask what if and refuses to accept the word impossible even when the path is blocked by shadows and doubt. The status of World Heritage means that the building is now protected for all generations to come, and its beauty is preserved like a pressed flower in the pages of history, ensuring that the light will always dance upon its tiles and the music will always echo within its wooden heart. Think of the grit and the raw imagination that turned Jorn Hudson's wild hand-drawn sketch into the most recognizable horizon on the planet, a silhouette that is as famous as the skyline of Manhattan or the lights of Paris, yet remains unique in its organic and sculptural form. There's a profound and deep rest in the realization that something so complex and so difficult to build can eventually become a source of such simple and pure peace for those who walk past it or sit within its walls. The journey from a controversial competition entry to a global icon is a long, slow walk to the landscape of human perseverance, where every setback was just a reason to breathe deeper and look further toward the horizon. As you listen to the steady flow of this final chapter, let your mind wander to the quiet harbor at night where the building stands in silent vigil over the dark water, its shells glowing with a soft moonlight that seems to come from within the stone itself. It is a reminder that imagination is the most powerful tool we possess, and that with enough patience the wildest dreams can take root in the earth and reach for the stars until they become a permanent part of our world. The engineering crisis and the rising costs and the political storms have all faded into a distant memory, leaving only the elegant geometry of the sphere and the shimmering chevron tiles as a legacy of a time when humanity decided to build something that had never been seen before. The Opera House is a sanctuary of sound and a cathedral of light where the frantic pace of the modern world slows down to a rhythmic crawl, and the only thing that matters is the beauty of the moment and the strength of the vision that brought it into being. As you sink deeper into your pillows, feel the weight of the history that supports this building and the lightness of the sails that seem to float above the water, providing a sense of balance and harmony that flows through the story and into your own thoughts. The UNESCO recognition is a seal of approval from the past and a promise to the future that we will always value the things that are difficult to create and beautiful to behold. The horizon of Sydney is now defined by these white peaks which look like a mountain range rising from the sea, and as the sun sets on this narrative, the image of the sails is the last thing you see before the world turns to velvet black. The story of the impossible building is finally complete, and it leaves you with a sense of quiet satisfaction and a belief in the power of the human heart to transform a simple idea into a timeless reality. The air is cool and the harbor is still, and the lights of the city are dimming one by one as the masterpiece watches over the world in a state of eternal grace. Let the repetition of this thought be your final lullaby as You drift into a deep and restorative sleep where the lines are smooth and the colors are soft, and the spirit of imagination carries you away into a dreamless and perfect rest that lasts until morning light returns to start the cycle of beauty all over again.